right, you can see me. I'm Pastor Gillespie from St. John Evangelical Lutheran Church and School, Sherman Center, Random Lake, Wisconsin. It is January 27th, 2021, and this is our Bible study on the book of Hebrews. We've been working our way through Hebrews on and off for some time now. It's a dense book. It is preaching and teaching that assumes quite a bit of you, the hearer, listener, receiver of God's Word. And so I think it's worth intense study, one that I've never done before, so hopefully you've been blessed by it so far as well. So I see you checked in there, Don, Eileen, Gus, and a few others too that haven't checked in the chat, so good to have you this evening. Let me get the class up on the screen here. There we go. Hopefully that's not too small for you, but I would suggest, if you'd like, that you grab yourself a Bible and turn with me to begin to Psalm 110. All right. And we'll use this for our prayer today. Psalm 110, is that what I wanted? Hold on. Oh, it went to Psalm 150. That's why it's confusing me. I'm like, that's not Psalm 110. Aha, there we go. Good. All right, let's begin. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of your strength out of Zion, rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people shall be volunteers in the day of your power. In the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning, you have the dew of your youth. The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He shall execute kings in the day of his wrath. He shall judge among the nations. He shall fill the places with dead bodies. He shall execute the heads of many countries. He shall drink of the brook by the wayside. Therefore, he shall lift up his head. There ends the reading. All right, good. So let's see. I'll make sure I get everything up on here. This would be one of the situations where I'd love to have multiple screens. I could have it all on one screen, and I have to juggle things around a little bit for this to work. All right, good. Oh, good to see you, Tim. All right. So you remember, we've talked about this frequently, that Psalm 110 verse 4, which you see there in the middle of the screen, is really a theme verse for this book. And what we're going to see over the next 3 chapters of the book, which we will most definitely not get through all 3 chapters before beginning of Lent and the resumption of Wednesday evening services then. But chapter 7, chapter 8, 9, and 10 all deal with this theme right here, which was introduced way at the beginning in the first couple chapters, really had a great deal of exposition at the beginning of chapter 5. Then we had a brief hiatus where he berated the congregation for their spiritual immaturity. And now we're back to the theme. The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So we have to deal with this Melchizedek character and how he is the type. He's a type of Christ. All right. Or rather, he is the type and Jesus is the antitype. Well, we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. All right. So in the interest of recap, as I just said, we're really picking up today where we left off in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 10. All right, so let's just recap the context that the writer-preacher gives us here. So also, Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, "You are my son, today I've begotten you." Remember, that's from Psalm 2. As he also says in another place, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." There it is, Psalm 110, verse 4. Who, in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, who was heard because of his godly fear, though he was a son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain since you have become dull of hearing. There's that beginning of that admonition, right? And then we're going to, again, there was a break, and then we skip all the way to chapter 7, and we pick up where we left off. for this Melchizedek. All right? So that's what we're going to start with today, and then I'll give you a little bit more background. We'll have to do some more background about this Melchizedek character. So let's consider today, I don't think it's unreasonable to consider everything you see on your screen there. That is verses 1 through 10. I think we should be able to get through that, but we'll see. And by the way, if you're following along, if this is your first time joining us, be sure to post your comments or questions below, and appreciate that. Your interaction, it makes it a little bit less lecture-y and more entertaining. And this evening, in my Louder with Crowder mug, who returns on February 1st, which I'm excited about, filled with a delicious latte, which I made with coconut milk, since I can't have unpasteurized dairy. I can only have unpasteurized raw dairy, which you can't buy in Wisconsin. Okay, let's read. Now, remind you, I'm going to use Dr. Kleinig's translation. Dr. Kleinig wrote, I think, the definitive commentary on this book, which I use for quite a bit of our source material. All right. So it'll be slightly different than what you see on the screen, but you should be able to follow along. And if you have your own translation, that's fine too. Follow along there. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, the one who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom Abraham also apportioned a tithe of everything, who is first being translated as King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, which is King of Peace, without father or mother or genealogy, not having a beginning of days nor an end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest without interruption. Verse 4, contemplate then how great this man was, to whom the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. On the one hand, those sons of Levi who receive the priesthood have a mandate, according to the law, to levy tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, even though they have come from the loins of Abraham. But on the other hand, he who does not have his genealogical descent from them has taken a tithe from Abraham and has blessed him who has the promises. Without any dispute, the lesser person is blessed by the greater. Verse 8. Now here, on the one hand, men who are dying receive the tithes, but there, on the other hand, he of whom it is testified that he is living receives them. So one might also almost say that through Abraham, also Levi, who receives tithes, has paid a tithe, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. All right. So we have a lot of things that we probably, contextual and words that we need to cover. Let's see. We need to talk about who this Melchizedek character is, of course, and then, of course, the context with Abraham by his visit. We also will need to talk about what a tithe is according to the law. All right. So let's do both of those things. As far as Melchizedek, he shows up in Genesis 14. So we're going to go all the way to the beginning of chapter 14 so you can get the Abraham bit. I don't know how much of this to read. You just need to see kind of the context of what's going on here. All right. So it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Ellasar, Chedorlaomer, close enough, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations. Okay, maybe not close enough. Let's look at the Hebrew. Chedorlaomer. Yeah. Kedorlaomer. Okay. Kedorlaomer. Whatever. Verse 2, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemaber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zor. So you got all these battles going on. We have all these people that are fighting against each other. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and 13th year they rebelled. 14th year they came, they attacked. All right, you're seeing all this. Verse 7, they turned their back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and attacked all the country of the Amalekites. Okay, so there's more battles going on. The Amorites who dwelt in Hazazon Tamar. All right, and then we're eventually get to Abraham here. And the kings of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, fine places, right? The king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, the king of Bela, that is Zor, went out and joined together in battle in the valley of Shittim against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, title king of the nations, etc., etc., etc. 4 kings against 5. Easy names, yeah, right. Now the valley of Shittim was full of asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some fell there, the remainder fled to the mountains. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. Now pay attention. Right, so we had these battles of the 2 kings, the 9 kings, the 4 against the 5. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. All right. Then, verse 13, one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abram. Now we know about this place, Mamre, right, in the terebinth trees, because that's where his wife is later will be buried, and Abraham himself. And eventually Joseph, actually, Jacob and Joseph will both be buried there too. Now, when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. All right, so you see, Abram, he basically comes in and scoops up what remains of these 9 kings that went to battle against each other. And he ends up with quite a bounty, right? All the goods, which is going to come up here in a bit in our conversation about tithing, all right? And now the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley Shaveh, that is in the King's Valley, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. All right, and then that will come up again later on. There's the promise, there's the Chaldeans. Yeah, then all this stuff with the king comes up later after the promise and the visit from Melchizedek. Okay, because we didn't quite deal with the king of Sodom and Gomorrah yet, but you know how that goes. But in the midst of this, a strange thing happens, okay? I don't know how else to say it. A strange character shows up, and a strange thing happens. And then the writer to the Hebrews uses this, because the Psalm does, Psalm 110, uses this and really broadly expands in his preaching, teaching, on what is just a kind of odd experience here. But I think there's much to be learned. All right, so verse 18, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tithe of all. So note, this is Abram giving a blessing to Melchizedek, a tithe, right? And the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons and take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from a thread of to the sandal strap, and that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you say, I have made Abram rich, except only that which the young men have eaten, the portion of the men who went with me. Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. And after these things, then the Lord appears and gives one of his promise of the son. But the only thing that we've got here, I don't know if I can highlight this. Yeah, I can. Are these 3 verses about Melchizedek, king of Salem. It's right in the midst. He's not one of the kings that fought. He's this king of Salem, later to be known as Jerusalem, right? So what can we talk about this Melchizedek in this story? You'd say, well, how much is there to say about this Melchizedek? It doesn't seem that there's a whole lot to say in just these few verses here, right? All right. But like I said, we're going to get 3 chapters of exposition on what is basically 3 verses here in Genesis. So, I suppose that's not surprising to you. If you're a hearer of God's word, you know that pastors can get a little bit long-winded. So again, that's basically it when it comes to Melchizedek, at least as far as Old Testament context. But he's going to use this and broadly expand it. But note again, just before we skip away from it, Melchizedek brings bread and wine, and then serves Abram as a priest, basically. And then Abram offers a word of blessing, or receives a word of blessing, I should say, from Melchizedek, and then Abram gives him a tithe of all, and namely the tithe here of all that he's talking about, or 1/10. This is of all that we saw back here, all the goods in verse 16 that he received, the spoils of war that he received from the 318 fighting men. All right, so let's go back to Hebrews now. That's a little bit of context. Not a lot, but something. But watch what he does with this. Now, what he's going to do, actually, is he's going to take Psalm 110, verse 4, and he's going to basically divide it into 3 themes, and then those 3 expositions are going to be in a row here in chapter 7. We're only going to deal with the first of those 3 tonight, I think. We'll see how far we get. All right. So, and we probably need to talk about tithing too, because that comes up pretty quick. All right, so for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, we saw all of that, right, back in Genesis, who met Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, right? So we heard about what Abram did, and going and picking up the slaughter of what the kings left behind. Blessed him, to whom Abraham gave a 10th part of all. All right, so that's as far as we want to go so far. So this 10th part of all, or as it was translated back there in Genesis, is rightly called the tithe. All right, now you've probably heard of the tithe if you're at all familiar with Christian church practice, right? Some would say that the tithe no longer applies to the Christian, being part of the New Covenant, the New Testament church, not part of the Old Covenant. Others would say the tithe is a good thing. I would argue a proportional gift is good, and 10% is a good place to start, if you can. All right. It is a practice of faith, but it comes out of the Pentateuch, right? Back from Leviticus chapter 27. So let's go look at that too. We'll come back to Hebrews. What did I say? Leviticus 27. It's also in Numbers. It's also in Deuteronomy. But let's use Leviticus, I think. 27. Yeah, here we go. Verse 30. And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. If a man wants at all to redeem any of his tithes, he shall add 1/5 to it. And concerning the tithe of the herd of the flock, or of the flock, of whatever passes under the rod, the 10th one shall be holy to the Lord. All right. Yeah. So there you go. So you have this tithe. It's 1/5 of all grain or of fruits of the tree. I would suppose it includes olives, maybe. I don't know. Is that a fruit or a vegetable? Tomatoes, fruits or vegetable, but certainly grain, and then of herds and flocks. And this would all be offered to God in the temple. Of course, this is what would be used then to feed those who served in the temple, the Levitical priesthood. All right. So agricultural produce and all livestock born each year, 1/10 of those. It was offered, this tithe is considered holy, that is set apart for God's good use. And it would be offered to God in the divine service and in the temple, in the tabernacle originally, and then in the temple later. And then it was given all to the Levites. Let's look at Numbers. I mentioned that. See if there's more on the tithe there. Yes, here we go. Now you understand it being for the Levites. Behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tithes in Israel as an inheritance in return for the work which they perform. A worker deserves his wages, right? The work of the tabernacle of meeting. Hereafter the children of Israel shall not come near the tabernacle of meeting lest they bear sin and die. A second. I don't feel like turning off the heat, but it's getting a little warm. All right, but the Levites shall perform the work of the tabernacle of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a statute forever throughout their generations, that among the children of Israel they shall have no inheritance. For the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer up as a heave offering to the Lord, I have given to the Levites as an inheritance. Therefore I have said to them, among the children of Israel, they shall have no inheritance. All right, so they had no land, no property. They were a tribe without land. All right, so of course, there's something to be learned here. Those who serve in the church should receive their earnings from the church, right? We're talking about the pastors, the teachers. To expect them to tend tables, we hear about this with in the Acts of the Apostles, or to go about tent making as Paul does as a missionary. That's not the normal practice. Yes, because they have no other. I mean, they can't count on livestock or grain. I mean, they have an agrarian culture. How else are they going to make a living, basically, to support their family? So they're supported by the tithes. These tithes being mandated, 10%, which is a blessing to the Levites and a burden to the rest of the people. But God loves a cheerful giver, right? So don't think of it as a burden to support your pastor, please. Anything else there? Oh, there's a little bit more here. Yeah, look at this. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak thus to the Levites, and say to them, when you take from the children of Israel the tithes which I have given you from them as your inheritance, then you shall offer up a heave offering to the Lord, a tenth of the tithe." So they still return 10% back of the 10% they receive. And your heave offering shall be reckoned to you as though it were grain of the threshing floor, as a fullness, or the fullness of the winepress, right? So they offer it to the Lord, and then they receive it back as if it were surplus. Thus you shall also offer a heave offering to the Lord from all your tithes, which you receive from the children of Israel, and you shall give the Lord's heave offering from it to Aaron the priest, etc., etc. All right. And there's also a little bit more in Deuteronomy regards to this tithe. All right. Now, this is all the context of what was going on with Abraham and with Melchizedek. That's why we're looking at this, and it really does pertain. So, verse 22 and 23: you shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year, and you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide, the tithe of your grain and your new wine and your oil. So there's the tithe of the oil. I thought olives were included. Of the firstborn of your herds and your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord God always. All right, so the rest would be eaten in the sanctuary. It's also then understood that this tithe applies to spoils of war. We see this really kind of established by David in 1 Samuel. So you can see that up on the screen. This is 1 Samuel 30, beginning verse 19. And nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything which they had taken from them. David recovered all. Then David took all the flocks and herds that had driven before those other livestock and said, "This is David's spoil." All right. And where does he do the tithe? They've got this the battle. Eventually they come and they get more spoil. Yeah. I don't see it designated there as the tithe. Right, that's what my notes say, but all right. Oh, wait a minute. I think it was back in Numbers. All right, we see David setting aside the spoils. Numbers 31, maybe. Ah, yes, there it is. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Count up the plunder that was taken of man and beast. You and Eleazar the priest and the chief fathers of the congregation divide the plunder in two parts between those who took part in the war, who went out to battle, and all the congregation. Levy a tribute for the Lord on the men of war who went out to battle." And then there's specific levy that's given then into the temple, the heave offerings, etc. And of the children of Israel's half, so the fighting men got half, children of Israel got half, and then there's a levy from that, a tithe that's taken from. It's not exactly a tithe because it's not 10, so it's just called a levy here, a share of the spoils. All right, so that's all the context that's going on with Abraham. So we have both the tithe, and then we also have this division of the plunder. All right, let's go back to Numbers 7 so you can see it here. Not number 7. Sorry. Hebrews 7. There we go. All right, good. All right, what else do we need to do here? Any other contextual things? I mean, we do want to note here in verse 3 that this Melchizedek character is without father. So there's three negatives to describe him positively, if that makes sense. So without father, without mother. So no patronage, no matronage, I guess. No genealogy. No beginning and end. But made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. I suppose what we need to talk about a little bit is the purpose of a genealogy. All right, because this pertains to our reading quite intentionally. Was there something else in there I was going to talk about? No, but it comes up here with the patriarch Abraham giving him a tenth of the spoils. So we're talking about patronage. So where... I was going to tell you a little bit about genealogies and how this works in the ancient world. Yeah, without beginning, without end. I don't remember where. Looking at Dr. Kleinig's notes here, I don't remember where he put this. All right, well, we'll come back to that if I find it. All right, so what we're doing here is we're doing two sets of comparisons at the same time in this text. So now we'll dig in more specifically. There's two things that the preacher-teacher is doing here. I'll make sure there's no comments, no questions. No. All right, good. He's comparing, he's got a vertical comparison, right? So he's got Melchizedek and Jesus, right, being compared. And then he has a horizontal comparison too. Well, actually two of those. He's got Abraham and he's got Levi. All right, and so we're looking at this complicated relationship when it comes to who offers what to who, in regards to tithes and to blessings, right? And so we're trying to navigate that. And it's all to teach us, of course, who is Jesus, who is our high priest after the order of Melchizedek, Psalm 110, verse 4. All right, so we're picking up where we left off from back in chapter 5, which we talked about already. Again, it really centers around this genealogy topic. Okay, I think we can get into it now. Where does he come from? Where did he go? This is very important in the ancient world. For example, we see, say, in Matthew chapter 1, we have a genealogy from Abraham. Luke chapter 3, we have a genealogy from Joseph back to David. John chapter 1, we have genealogy from God to the present day for Jesus, right? We have a creation story. Who you are, namely who you came from, who is your family, where is your place of origin, where is your birth, and then it's also important in the ancient world where you end. All right, so the beginning and the end of someone is very important, more so than what we think of today. They see life. I mean, obviously, it's part of what it means to be human, sinful human, is that you are born and you die. Right? No death. The wages of sin is death. That's part of being human in every way that we know, except for in Jesus, of course, who defeats death. And for us who have been joined to him, who will just fall asleep now. In the ancient world, though, this is quite particular. And so then they would have a genealogy. Genealogy was quite important. It would tell you your place in the family, and it would also tell you the place in society. All right, so your social status, your legal status, right? You might be of a priestly order in the case of Levi. But this was also the case, of course, in Greek and Roman society as well, and other societies. What positions of responsibility you might have within the society and the family. Ownership of land and property would be handed down throughout the family, of course. Inheritance, so other wealth in addition to property and land. And then in the case of royal or priestly families, like we see with Levi, and royal being like the king here, also then eligibility for the office, right? Because the office is conferred to the son. This is all at play here with Jesus, right? Because they mention genealogy twice. We see it in verse 3. See it there without genealogy, referring to Salem. And then referring to Abraham, he whose genealogy, actually it's to, now it's to Jesus, whose genealogy is not derived from, Melchizedek again, whose genealogy is not derived from them, from Abraham, received tithes from Abraham. All right, so genealogy is quite important when it comes to Melchizedek. And of course, then that's going to be very important for us in regards to Jesus, right? Who is his family? What's his family tree? Where does he come from? Where is he going? How is he going to die? Is he in a royal family? Is he in a priestly family? Then what's his eligibility for the offices within that family? What is his ownership? What's his land? What's his kingdom, if you like? What's his responsibility? What's his legal or ritual status? All of those things are at play. So then that gets a little bit tricky for somebody like Melchizedek, doesn't it? Because we have to find out where Melchizedek's kingship comes from, where his priestly service comes from. By what authority does he do these things, to quote the Pharisees to Jesus, right? And it can't come from a human source, because as the writer or preacher teacher of the Hebrew says, he's without father, without mother, without genealogy, right? So his status, his authority, does not come from earthly patronage, earthly people, but it comes from the Most High God, after whom he is a priest, and after the order of the Most High God. Of course, you also have without beginning and without end of life, without teleos. All right. So this character, he's very mysterious. Again, he's only three verses back in Genesis 14. And yet he serves as this wonderful foreshowing, this picture, forward-pointing picture of who Jesus is. All right. Notice how the stress is on the meeting of Melchizedek, king of Salem, with Abraham, and not the king of Sodom. All right. Well, that will come up later on. Actually, we'll talk a little bit about Salem. But what is noted by Melchizedek are two things, and these are the two things he's going to focus on: that he is the king of Salem, right? So you see that right away in verse 1, and that he's the priest of the Most High God. So he has two titles, which is also curiously unique, right? That he's understood both as king and priest and king, a double office. Obviously, Most High God is the title for Yahweh, the only true God, the God of Israel. Of course, Zeus was referred to as the Most High as well. I think that's pretty common for ancient gods, ancient world gods. Later on, the office of king and priest are going to be separated. That was under Joshua, for example, because Moses was both priest and a sort of king, right? Or, yeah, that's right, because he does battle, but he also serves the people. The next thing that's highlighted is that Melchizedek, in verse 1, he met with Abraham and he blessed him. So he does two things for him. This doesn't happen before the battle, but it happens after the battle, as Abraham was returning with the spoils from war. So, again, this is after the slaughter of the kings. And then what else? And then the other thing we talked about, of course, is that Abraham matched the gift of the blessing with a tithe of a tenth. Of course, the tithe being received by Melchizedek because he is a priest of the Most High God, who had given Abraham the victory. And maybe too, Abraham is acknowledging him as king by sharing with him a source of the booty, if you like, the spoils of war. Of course, how does this point forward to Jesus? Because everything ends up being about pointing us to the gospel. Jesus blesses those who have faith in him and who are descendants of Abraham, of course. Now, the royal office is really what distinguishes him. And so then he's going to deal quite a bit with this. His name is Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek means literally, Zedek is righteousness, Melchi is king. So king of righteousness, literally. It's his throne name, if you like. The name given to him at his coronation. It shows his mission as king. He goes about ruling by righteousness. And so we would say then, according to the preacher-teacher of the Hebrews here, this king, Melchizedek, and again, this is all a type of Christ, pointing forward to Christ, who is the antitype. His duty, as given to him by the Most High God, is to rule in righteousness. And then he has an additional title too, though. He's the king of Salem, which means peace, right? The king of peace. So they define that for us. Shalom in Hebrew is related to Salem. They're in the same word group, right? Shalom, is peace. That's the not the Vulcan sign, but actually the Hebrew sign. This is what the rabbis, when they give the Aaronic benediction, they make the shalom. The sheen is the Hebrew character. They make that with their hands. All right, I think we've talked about that before. So we have two titles going on here. It's probably worth looking at Psalm 76, because you'll see these two at play there too. All right. We have the battle here. Oh, yeah. No, it's right here at the beginning. In Judah, God is known. His name is great in Israel. In Salem also is his tabernacle. That's Jerusalem, of course. Yep. And his dwelling place in Zion, another name for Jerusalem. There he broke the arrows of the bow, the shield, and the sword of battle. I don't know where the next part is. I think that's awesome. You see him as the king here in this text, the king of Salem. All right, good enough. Let's see. So the contrast then between righteousness, which usually we might translate that as justice, and peace, is that he rules with a different sort of righteousness, I guess is how you put it. That his righteousness is not by politically engaging in battle, like Abraham, as he fought the four kings in Genesis 14. But rather, his righteousness is the benediction, the blessing of God's name. So that's how he rules. So he's of a different sort of kingship. Because we don't know anything more about this kingdom either, of course. Okay, so now again, he describes his kingship with these four negatives: without father, without mother, without genealogy, right? Now, these are inferred. We didn't see any of that in Genesis 14. It was not mentioned there. It's just inferred because no mention is found before and found after Genesis 14 to describe who this guy is and where he came from and where he goes. Normally, again, your genealogy would locate you in a particular royal family, or if you were a priest, within a priestly lineage, so that you would have a place within that lineage. But he was also then lacking he's lacking any kind of human identity and status. But then he also has no beginning of days nor end of days, right? End of life, which is peculiar. These two arguments, this first one, without father, mother, or genealogy, that's going to be verses 11 through 14, which we'll look at hopefully next week. And then, what's the next part? Without beginning of days nor end of life, which he actually expands upon that in verses 15 through 19 of this chapter. So we're not going to deal with that too much tonight. But there are no records of his birth or of his death. Most significantly, the silence about his death then is going to be the whole bit on the argument that he's still alive. And that will come up in verse 8. You see it there? Here mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. Right? So the preacher-teacher assumes that Melchizedek is still living because there's no record of his death, which is kind of curious, isn't it? He doesn't resemble any kind of human ancestor anyway because, as he says in verse 3, he's made like the Son of God. And he remains a priest continually without interruption. Where and how? No idea. Exactly. This character in Genesis 14 is crazy enough on its own. And then to have such a 3-chapter expansion on those 3 verses is incredible. But I think quite a bit of fun to deal with. Okay, so there's nothing that terminates his priestly service, or his kingship, rather, either. Not death, not retirement. There's nothing. And he has no human ancestry. So there's no one like him in the past, present, or future, except for Jesus. So this Melchizedek effectively then becomes a sign or a token of the end times eternal priesthood of Jesus. And whether Moses knew that's what was going on or not, who knows? Now, the preacher-teacher says, now that you know this about him, remember, he was talking about the congregation being, immature and only having spiritual milk. Now they have to deal with this text. This is spiritual meat if there ever was one. Verse 4, then he says, now consider how great this man was. All right, so he's encouraging you to think about it a little bit here. Use your brain muscle, right? To Abraham, who is defined as a patriarch, right? So now we have talked, by saying patriarch, he's talking about genealogies, right? Abraham, who is the father of us all by faith, right? Think of Galatians 4, for example. So this is kind of strange that Abraham, who is the patriarch, would give a tenth of his spoils to a man who was without genealogy, right? Because you give the spoils to someone greater than yourself. And yet this Melchizedek has no earthly authority. He's not above Abraham. He's not like Abraham's father or something like that. So that's kind of odd. And then he talks about the sons of Levi who receive tithes from the sons of Abraham because they have, even though they come from the loins of Abraham, but their genealogy is separate. So God sets Levi apart and then establishes them to be served by the rest of the children of Abraham, right? And provide tithes to them. But not with Melchizedek. All right? So hopefully you're getting the hang of this here. Now they have this mandate to do this, right? We read those mandates about tithes from Numbers and Leviticus, right? We looked at that already. So according to God's law, all the sons of Aaron receive tithes from Abraham's family. It doesn't matter which children they are, which tribe of Jacob, etc. The Levitical priesthood would be provided with tithes to support them. All right, now Melchizedek, though, he's a priest, but he's not of Levi, and he's a king, but he's not of the patriarch Abraham. So we've got a problem, right? You see the conflict? Abraham gives him a tenth of the spoils, and so would the sons of Levi as well. Why did he do this? Because Abraham was blessed by Melchizedek with the promises, as we see here in verse 6. And he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises, right? Blessed Abraham who had the promises. So he did this as the priest of God, Abraham did, who had given the promises of blessing to Abraham and his descendants. Melchizedek did this. So what the preacher-teacher is saying here is Melchizedek outranks Abraham. We consider ourselves children of Abraham, but here Melchizedek actually outranks even Abraham, the patriarch of Israel, and he outranks Levi, by whom the whole Israelite priesthood is named. So this guy, this king of Salem, the king of righteousness, who appears for 3 verses, is of higher status and authority, according to any standard of the ancient world and according to God's own word, than both Abraham and Levi, both the Levitical priesthood, the father of the Levitical priesthood, and the father of many nations, of all nations, Abraham. Now that should be startling. That's what he's trying to suggest here. This is remarkable, and that's why he's going to deal so much time with it. I feel like when we bump into a strange Bible text, that I'd like to spend even more time on it than I would on something that's a little bit more obvious, and try to tease out as much as possible out of it. I'm trying to think what Dr. Nagel said. It's something. The quote goes something like this. I remember hearing this in a sermon, because it was common practice after Vatican II that the readings would often have ellipses in it where they would skip a few verses. And he said something like, "Gentlemen," I can't do his British accent, but gentlemen, always pay attention to the parts that they leave out. Right? That's where, that's going to be the most interesting part. The things that they skip over, the things that they rush past, are probably the things that you want to pay the most attention to. I thought that was really clever. And it's true. That's true. All right, so we have to think about these tithes and blessings, because that's what's going on here. There's a tithe and the blessing. Remember, the blessing came first, after this, and then Abraham gave of the spoils of the war. So think about the cycle of blessing in Deuteronomy. The tithe is taken from the produce of the land, which is a result of God's blessing of the people, right? Because God is the one who grants the produce of the land. It's his blessing to them. So God blesses them, then they return with the tithe. So the people present it to God through the Levitical priests in order to acknowledge that God has blessed them and that he is the source of all their produce, right? This is why we give offerings. Not just because the church needs our money, which is true, and we're very thankful to receive it, myself especially. But that's not what we're doing. It's actually a confession of faith. We're saying to God, thank you for these gifts, and as a confession of that faith, I'm going to give 10% or more, as guided by the Spirit, for the church to use, to support the ministry there. My goal as a Christian congregation, and maybe it's yours too, is to encourage such generosity among the people of God that we end up at the end of the year with extra money we don't know what to do with. And then we have to look around and say, who can we spend this money on? Wouldn't that be a wonderful gift, right? A wonderful place to be. We say, now we can look around. We've taken care of our own needs. Now we can look to the needs of our neighbor with this surplus. Wouldn't that be incredible? And what a joyous experience that would be to say, hey, who can we help? I mean, maybe it's not local. Maybe we say, we know that a congregation in Siberia, where I have friends, that is in great need. And we say, here, use it as best you can. Or to support a particular missionary, support the Pastor Bloss in Sheboygan with the Hispanic ministry, or support the Comfort Dogs and their work, whatever it is. To have that kind of surplus. Yeah. I know it seems crazy, but it's not as crazy as it sounds. Because it is just a simple matter of, if every household in our congregation gave 10% of what they receive, they gave 10% of what they received, we would have a surplus. And we'd actually, everybody would get paid well that works for the congregation, and we'd still have a surplus. That's it. That's all it would take. Yeah. Thanks, Don. I mean, really what I'm suggesting is it's just be a huge leap of faith, and it would require great acts of sacrifice, especially if you've gotten comfortable living by giving 3% or 5% to the church or whatever it is. Yeah. Let's see. Everyday Akram. Thanks for your comment. This is on Twitch. I'm just going to reply to it. What is Lutheran? I'm just going to send him to our website. Check out our website. Sorry, I'm doing this while we're broadcasting. Maybe I'll finish that later so we can stay on the Bible study. I'll get back to you here. Everyday Akram. Let's see. So what are we talking about? Yes, we're talking about offerings and tithes, right? So the presentation of the tithe from the spoils of battle, what is Abraham suggesting then? That God gave him the victory in the battle, you see? So it's a confession of faith, and he offers that then as a gift to the priest, the proper priest, Melchizedek. All right. Now, verse 7, he gives a little axiom here. He says, now beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. All right? This is beyond contradiction. This is how it always works. This is how it works in the scriptures. The lesser coming usually first and the greater coming second, right? And that's what's called a horizontal type, or typology, horizontal typology. So think how any of the patriarchs, Joseph, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who else could we pick? David, Solomon, the prophets, Moses, Elijah, that they're all in their own way a foreshadowing or a type of the antitype who is Jesus. And all of history, all of those men, and then actually in a way all of the women too, and their faithfulness is all joined together in the new Adam in Christ Jesus, right? And that's all done in the horizontal. So I've sometimes diagrammed it. I don't have the screen up here. Let me, so you can see. Okay, yeah. I sometimes diagram it as like a funnel, and it's funneling down into Christ. And then from Christ, it funnels back out to us. Sorry, can't do this on the screen. You get the idea. Like wide to the narrow to Jesus and then back out. Yeah, okay, good. And so that's what we're talking about here. The lesser to the better, right? Abraham is the lesser, the better being Melchizedek. All right. And that's how it works. The one who can bless is going to be the greater, of course, right? The king can bless the servant. And then the person of lesser status returns with the tithe, right? Okay. So the father blesses his sons. Think of Jacob to his sons. Or the king blesses his people. That happens with David. It happens elsewhere. And bless being the transmission of a blessing by its enactment in a benediction, right? The Lord bless you and keep you, that kind of thing. Rather than just simply some kind of like, hey, you're blessed. Well, bless you, the kind of flippant or just, praiseworthy kind of thing that we use today. No, this is actually giving of a gift. Like, so say, for example, the Aaronic benediction, which you hear every Sunday, right? The Lord bless you and keep you, right? These are promises. They're actually giving you something. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. That is, to be kindly favored, disposed towards you, right? The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. That is, to look upon you with the forgiveness of sins, that you'd be at peace, right? These are all gifts that are enacted by the very words of blessing. They give what they say. All right. And then here, meaning here on earth, the mortal men receive tithes, right? Like the Levitical priests receive tithes. But there, that is with Melchizedek and Abraham, he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives, right? So now we're talking about Melchizedek, who is a priest forever, right? At Psalm 110, verse 4. So again, the preacher-teacher here isn't just making up this idea that he's this eternal priest, because it's right there in Psalm 110. It's in the one sense, it's done by exclusion. It's not mentioned in Genesis, and then it's by inclusion in the Psalm, in Psalm 110, verse 4, written by inspiration to David. Of course, that he's living all points to Jesus, of course, who's in the likeness and the order of Melchizedek, which we'll talk about more next time, that even though he died, yet he lives, right? Since Jesus is raised, he is alive, of course, in the same way as Melchizedek lives. And then finally, 2 more verses. Even Levi, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. Which is just, a crazy thought, right? So even though Levi was not yet born, he's many generations away from Abraham yet, when Abraham offers his offering of spoils of war to Melchizedek, in effect, Levi is also offering offerings, paying the tithe through Abraham. So again, this is that whole genealogical aspect, and this will come up quite a bit as we're moving through the book, moving forward. What are we going to call it? Like it's a ritual precedent, I guess, is what you'd say. It's not just about the superiority of Melchizedek over Abraham and Levi, but it also then is dealing with the divine source of Melchizedek's priesthood and of the blessing he transmitted to Abraham. So that's what we're dealing with. And Levi then is like a subset of that. All right, now, since we've gone through just 10 verses of this, and of course, like I said, there's going to be quite a bit more on Melchizedek next time. It's worth mentioning that this text, like many others, does not find a place in the liturgical life of the congregation. I don't know, how many times have we talked about this? We've talked about it frequently, right? That it's dense, and it'd probably be difficult. I just spent an hour on 10 verses, right? So, how difficult it would be to provide enough background information that you would know what's going on here. All right. We want to find out what Lutherans believe. All right. Okay. I found a link to post for the commenter here. So I'll just post that. Talking about what Lutherans believe. Boom. There we go. Good. But I still think it's worth us considering, especially verse 4, right? This idea of how great this man was, Melchizedek, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of his spoils. All right, this is to tell us something about the uniqueness of Melchizedek, but not Melchizedek alone, but namely then of Christ. Right, the uniqueness of Christ as our singular high priest and king, and really prophet too. And of course, then we have this whole aspect of the city, that he's the king of Salem, of the king of Jerusalem, the city of the Most High God, of the heavenly Jerusalem. All that will come up later, I think in chapter 12, so we have quite a ways. So Melchizedek will be used not in a horizontal sense, like what we're doing here, between Melchizedek and Abraham and Levi, but in a vertical sense. How much greater then is Christ than even Melchizedek? That vertical typology. How does God establish righteousness in Christ? Through the forgiveness of sins. How does Jesus, our high priest, how does he bring peace to his people on earth? He does it, again, through the forgiveness of sins. All right? So like Melchizedek, Jesus is a high priest who blesses God's people and receives your offerings. And through him, God blesses his people, blesses you, his people, I should say, by equipping you with good things that you need to know in order to do his will, so that you can present your offerings to God through Jesus as your high priest. That'll come up especially as far as your offerings in chapter 13. How else is Jesus like this Melchizedek from what we've seen today in our reading? Yeah, he's without human predecessor or successor in his office because he lives, right? He is the high priest of God, before God in heaven. And just as there was no high priest before Melchizedek, we don't even have the Levitical priest yet established, right? So there is no other great high priest in heaven and on earth except in Jesus, since Melchizedek. And since Jesus alone remains in the office forever, he's uniquely able to bridge heaven and earth and usher you, his people, from earth to heaven. Right? So we see in this strange character of Melchizedek, in this weird verse from Psalm 110 that this whole book is really based on, a wonderful type and shadow of who Jesus is. Right? All right. Yeah, any other questions? Don says this would be amazing. That's right, we're talking about the tithes. Is it too complicated? Was it too hard? I don't know. I don't want to go too fast. I feel like we always want to pull in enough backstory and then get enough time to get the logic here broken down, right? Of what you see, this logic of relationship that's going on in this section. All right. Well, I don't see anybody posting down below, so that's good. We're a few minutes past 8, so I suppose it's time. I thank you all for joining us this evening for our Bible study. I know we're not going real fast, but God willing, you're being blessed by our study of this book. I encourage you, if you haven't caught all of them, you can actually go back and listen to them on our YouTube page. You can search for St. John Random Lake on YouTube. Actually, search for St. John's Sherman Center. You'll find it then, for sure. I'd like to use Sherman Center more often because it's kind of a unique designation for us as a congregation. Well, it is unique. All right, Don says, well-paced. All right, good. Yeah, I don't want to rush it. I want to give you a chance for questions. I think next time we'll try to do about 8 verses. All right, so even less. But so it goes. All right, Lord be with you all this evening, and Lord give you a quiet night and peace at the last. We'll see you in the morning for a congregation of prayer.